Midnight clung to Harbor Street as the voicemail played on Ethan Cole's cracked phone. A trembling voice whispered, "They know where you are," before static chewed the line. He stood under a failing street lamp, listening for breath that wasn't his. Ethan said, "Who is this?" and his words fogged in the cold. A scream tore the silence from the alley, sharp enough to raise the hair on his neck. He ran, boots splashing through a thin skin of rain. There was no one in the gloom, only a small metal heart ticking on the pavement. Ethan said, "This isn't funny," and crouched as the lamp flickered. Strange symbols pulsed along the casing like dying embers. Somewhere a door slammed, and the echo sounded staged. The ticking grew steady, calm, almost patient. He reached out, then stopped, because every instinct told him the night had teeth. Morning found the small workshop quiet, and the ticking on Ethan's table did not belong to any clock. He lived among gears, dials, and patient tools, yet this thing sounded deliberate. Ethan said, "You're not a toy," and wrapped his hands in a suede cloth. The symbols refused to settle into meaning as if they shifted when he blinked. He checked a loop, and the lens caught a hovering red pulse. Ethan said, "Why call me?" and the question shook dust from old grief. The voicemail replayed, a shiver in the wires, a warning with no sender. The door buzzed twice, then stopped, as if the caller lost nerve. Ethan said, "Hold on," but the hallway stayed mute. He logged the pulse rate, slow, exact, almost kind. It felt like a countdown that had not chosen a number yet. Ethan called Lucas Reed because silence had become a pressure suit. Lucas worked nights and trusted patterns over people. Lucas said, "Describe it," and Ethan talked about the pulse, the marks, the scream. Lucas said, "Don't touch the core," and the advice felt too specific. A power surge blinked the workshop lights, and the device kept time without the grid. Ethan said, "It's self-powered," and the words tasted wrong. He checked for seams, found none, and felt watched by the objects he owned. The voicemail replayed again on its own, glitching at the same breath. Lucas said, "I'm coming over," and the line died like a held note. Ethan sealed the door and waited with a patience he did not believe in. Detective Helen Ward arrived before Lucas, wearing the look of someone who disliked surprises. Helen said, "You reported a scream near Harbor Street," and her tone kept the word near. Ethan gestured to the device, careful not to name it. Helen said, "Where did you get that?" as if it were contraband that voted. Pulse reflected in her badge, and made the room colder. Ethan said, "Found it in the rain," and the truth sounded staged even to him. She traced the air above it, refusing to touch, and logged the glow in her eyes. Helen said, "No record of a body," and the absence felt loud. She asked for the voicemail, then listened without moving. Her jaw ticked in a rhythm that matched the red light. Lucas finally arrived with a coffee that steamed like a signal. Lucas said, "I saw the alley, and someone scrubbed it clean," and the word clean felt like a threat. Helen checked the time and didn't share what she found. Ethan said, "Listen," and the device's pulse shifted to a double beat. The symbols brightened, then aligned like teeth underwater. Lucas said, "That's a counter, not a heart," and the room learned a new silence. Helen said, "If it's counting down, what's the zero, and never blink?" The voicemail auto played again, whispering the line that started all of this. Ethan said, "They knew I would listen," and reached for a pen instead of courage. The double beat held, patient as a loaded breath. Morning stretched thin across the workshop, and the red pulse kept its private time. Ethan sorted gears into neat constellations, pretending order could bridle dread. Ethan said, "You don't belong to any clock I know," and the room answered with hums. The loop pressed a ring on his brow like a quiet brand. A cracked photo on the wall showed a fair day and a gentler hymn. Ethan said, "I should have fixed what mattered first," and closed the frame face down. The pulse quickened when he looked away, as if it wanted attention. Old grief coughed up the sound of an ambulance he never outran. Ethan said, "Tell me what you are," and the symbols seemed to breathe. Outside, Traffic made a low tide of tires and brakes. He logged the beats and failed to log the fear that bled between them. He carried the device home because distance sometimes softened danger. The hallway smelled of dust and fresh paint, like a story trying to reset itself. Mara Jensen opened her door with a mug and wary smile. Mara said, "Rough night," and her voice knew the answer. Ethan said, "Heard anything strange?" and looked past her shoulder at the quiet. The device ticked inside his bag as if eavesdropping. Mara said, "Elevator stalled at 3 again," and the detail felt like a nudge. He promised to fix a loose latch he had ignored for weeks. Ethan said, "Thanks for checking in," and meant it more than he let show. He locked his door and set the bag on the table like a guest. The pulse steadied, grateful to be seen. His apartment listened. A note slid under the door like a thin hiss of paper. It said, "Meet the ferry dock at dusk," and wore no signature. Ethan said, "You move fast," and checked the peephole on habit. Dusk arrived like a bruise, and the river took it without complaint. The dockboards ticked under his boots in a rhythm that mocked the device. Avery Cross stepped from shadow with a posture that apologized for nothing. Avery said, "You have something that counts down," and his eyes did not blink. Ethan said, "Who are you?" and the wind braided river chill into the pause. A gull's cry sounded like a torn thread. Avery said, "I was sent to keep you alive long enough to listen." The red pulse reflected in the water and refused to drown. Detective Helen Ward chose a diner because stainless surfaces confess. Helen said, "You keep changing stories by leaving parts out," and stirred coffee she did not drink. Neon wrote red across the window and underlined every doubt. Ethan said, "I found it. Then it found me, and hated the truth in that shape." The waitress topped water and left without a note, a witness by design. Helen said, "No body, no incident report, but there's cleanup on harbor," and tapped her phone. He thought of scrubbed brick and rinsed fear. Ethan said, "Someone wants me to listen to a deadline," and the phrase felt earned. Helen said, "Then we need to know who said it," and stopped tapping. The pulse in his bag matched the clock on the wall, then overtook it. Back at the workshop, Lucas waited with printouts that smelled like heat. Lucas said, "I mapped the intervals, and they form a phrase if you code them," and set papers down. Ethan said, "Whose language?" and the room held its breath. The symbols looked like roads on a dark atlas. Lucas said, "Not any cipher we teach, but someone wanted you to hear it," and drew lines between beats. The voicemail played again without a command, and stopped one word early. Ethan said, "I missed a call years ago," and the floor stayed where it was by effort. Lucas said, "Grief is not a tool, but it can point," and closed the laptop. The pulse slowed as if listening to them think. They listened back and learned the sound of almost. Night folded around the workshop, and the pulse tapped like a metronome learning speech. Ethan graphed intervals until the lines resembled streets on a buried map. Lucas said, "Listen for absence, not beats," and cut the audio to near silence. In the thin gap, a faint click lived between pulses like a swallowed syllable. Ethan said, "Morse would shout, 'This just breathes,' and marked the voids." A generator 2 blocks away hiccuped the same minute each hour. Lucas said, "If power grids stutter, the pattern might ride the city." The voicemail replayed with a new artifact, a paper scrape at the end. Ethan said, "Someone is still recording us," and the window felt too clear. He killed the lights, and the device glowed like a patient ember. The map in his head shifted, and the river became the spine. They traced the pattern to the river substation, where fences hummed and signs warned softly. Helen met them with a clipboard and a key she should not have. Helen said, "If I ask later, you never saw me," and the gates sighed open. The transformers wore halos of insect glow, and the ground smelled like storms. Ethan said, "The pulse doubles when we face north," and the compass trembled a degree. Lucas said, "Shielding is uneven here," and pointed to a maintenance shed scarred by heat. Helen called dispatch for a false alarm. She would cancel soon. The device thrummed, then quieted, as if greeted by kin. Ethan said, "It knows this noise," and felt the fence in his teeth. They logged coordinates while the river pushed black under the moon. Avery appeared by the river stairs with shoes that never squeaked. Avery said, "You are reading a broadcast meant for one listener," and did not name the sender. Helen said, "You keep arriving where my paperwork can't reach," and did not holster suspicion. The device's symbols brightened and rotated a quarter turn, aligning like teeth. Ethan said, "Then the listener is me," and the idea fit too well. Avery handed a folded map with creases like old scars. Avery said, 3 points form a word if you stand on them," and nodded to the substation lights. Lucas said, "Triangulate by time, not space, and set a timer to the double beat." The river lifted a cold breath that smelled like pennies. The timer chimed, and a fairy horn answered across the dark. They reached a derelict observatory where Ivy tried to sew shut the doors. Inside, dust drifted like slow constellations, and the dome creaked with memory. Lucas said, "These bearings still track," and spun a rusted wheel that protested. The device pulsed with the dome's rotation, sensing like a heartbeat learning a dance. Helen said, "Someone used this place recently," and pointed to clean footprints in old soot. Ethan said, "If the sky writes the code, we read it here," and set the device on a brass plate. A slender blink in the etchings formed an arrow toward a cracked mural. Avery said, "The mural hides a junction," and pressed a faint seam. A panel clicked and exhaled cold air that carried a metallic taste. The red pulse slowed, as if counting in words. Behind the panel, a narrow passage held a console that pretended not to be new. Wires braided into the wall like veins learning architecture. Lucas said, "This is recent work with antique manners," and checked for power. The device settled into a cradle that fit too perfectly. Ethan said, "If I leave it, do we lose the voice?" and his mouth found a drought. Helen said, "We document, then decide," and started a slow circle with her camera. Avery said, "Decision is a trap when the window is timed," and pointed to a hidden counter. The digits read a calm number that promised smaller numbers soon. The cradle locked with a sigh that felt like consent. Ethan said, "Then we listen at 0, and the passage held its breath for them." The observatory groaned as dawn burned off the fog, and Avery kept his hands visible. Avery said, "I can translate the next step, but not for free," and waited for the echo to die. Ethan weighed the word free like a coin too light. The device sat in its cradle and watched them all with patient dread. Lucas said, "We pay with what?" and tapped the console that pretended to be antique. Avery said, "Access and silence," and the dome clicked as if agreeing. Helen paced, counting screws that did not belong here. Helen said, "You trade in omissions," and her temper drew a clean line. The counter ticked down a digit that felt personal. Ethan said, "We listen, then we decide," and the air held its jaw tight. The map in his head rerouted to a cost he had not priced. They moved the device to a field kit, and the cradle released with a mechanical sigh. Helen said, "Chain of custody is a fairy tale now," and sealed the case anyway. Avery watched the horizon for a signal only he could see. Lucas said, "I need 5 hours," and his voice auditioned for certainty. Ethan said, "You have 2, and the counter agreed by hurrying. A wind pressed the dome and made it sound like a held note. Helen said, "You owe me the whole truth," and pinned Avery with the kind of stare that files reports. Avery said, "Truth is timed," and gestured to the ridge road. Ethan felt the old instinct to run, then remembered running never closed a loop. He shouldered the case, and the red pulse traveled with him. Back in the city, Mara waited outside Ethan's door with a key he never gave. Mara said, "Your lock never fooled anyone," and held up the latch he promised to fix. The hallway smelled of paint, thick enough to hide a year. Ethan said, "I'm out of favors," and meant the floor under his feet. She handed him a folded envelope with a neat, unkind crease. Mara said, This came for you at my place and did not ask why. That made sense. The note inside matched the symbols, printed in ink that bled like rust. Lucas said, "It's the same hand," and photographed the strokes. Avery said nothing and read it twice. Helen said, "Who is she to you?" And the question deserved weather. Ethan said, "Someone who kept me from vanishing," and pocketed the proof. The note led them to a storage facility where units hummed like quiet arguments. A manager waved them through after Helen manufactured a warrant with posture. Helen said, "We look, we leave, we breathe later," and the corridor swallowed their footsteps. Unit 317 opened on a lab that wore thrift store parts and brand new secrets. Lucas said, "Whoever built this loves old skins over new bones," and powered a bench. The device on the table was not theirs, but it pulsed in sympathy. Ethan said, "A decoy or a sibling," and both choices felt correct. Avery said, "Take the drive, leave the rest," and pointed to a single black square. The counter on Ethan's case shaved minutes that had not been offered. They regrouped in the diner where neon turned coffee into warnings. The drive yielded logs that named places Ethan avoided on principle. Lucas said, "These timestamps match the double beat," and drew a line no one liked. Helen said, "Your name appears as a receiver," and slid the screen across. Avery watched the door and let the accusation find its own chair. Ethan said, "I never signed for this," and the booth shrank by an inch. Mara arrived late and sat without asking permission. Mara said, "You let me keep the spare because you knew I would check," and her eyes asked more. The counter on the case clicked with a steady mercy. Ethan said, "We move on the nearest site," and stood before doubt could seat him again. They followed the logs to a riverfront relay buried beneath an overpass where trucks spoke in echoes. The air smelled like iron and wet rope. Lucas said, "This junction matches the double beat," and knelt by a fuse panel. Avery kept watch with a patience that looked rented. Helen said, "5 minutes, then we pull," and scanned the girders for eyes. Ethan set the device on a cold steel crate, and the pulse deepened. The relay hummed like a choir that forgot words. Mara said, "Tell me this ends with light on," and hugged her coat. Ethan said, "It ends with truth on," and the line surprised him. The device projected a faint grid that mapped the city's scars. The counter ticked down a digit, and the bridge seemed to exhale. Lucas cracked the drive and the relay bloomed with dates that remembered them. Lucas said, "Badge access from Ward, midnight on Harbor," and the silence did the math. Helen did not blink, which was an answer with corners. Helen said, "I ordered the cleanup to stop a panic," and it sounded like truth wearing armor. Avery said, "Your chain of custody ends in a locked room," and did not soften it. Ethan said, "You knew the scream was bait," and the bridge made a low, tired sound. Mara looked at the device as if it could grade them. Helen said, "I knew the message would find the one it wanted," and the target stepped into his own outline. The counter shed another minute. The relay lights dimmed and returned like a thought reconsidered. A feed flickered on the relay screen with a waveform that remembered the night. Helen said, "The scream was a recording from a closed case," and watched the way the word closed fell. Ethan said, "You chose my street," and felt the layout of his life point back at him. Avery said, "Because your ear hears patterns grief hides," and the compliment hurt. Lucas traced the waveform and found a notch shaped like a signature. Lucas said, "It's keyed to your voicemail timestamp," and circled the flaw. Mara said, "You were always going to open this," and did not move closer. The device shifted its symbols into lines that resembled names. Ethan said, "I won't be your instrument," and the relay hummed in doubt. The counter bled seconds like careful rain. A hidden camera window lit and showed a storage corridor that did not forget faces. A cleaner in a blank cap led someone past Unit 317. Mara said, "That's my buildings contractor," and color left her voice. Helen said, "They moved your spare for leverage," and swore without sound. Avery said, "We are late by design," and pulled a small jammer from his coat. Ethan said, "No more decoys," and the device answered with a sharper beat. Lucas overlaid timestamps and drew a route that avoided official roads. Mara said, "If they touch my door, I burn the map," and meant it. The relay lights fell to a hush as if listening for their choice. The counter turned a page and asked what happens next. They reached Unit 317's twin, where the corridor smelled like metal and apology. Inside, a second cradle waited, with a vacancy shaped like their device. Avery said, "Place it," and the city listens, and the words wore ownership. Helen drew her sidearm and did not point it yet. Helen said, "Not until we know the message," and authority remembered its spine. Lucas scanned the cradle and found a whispering uplink. Lucas said, "Zero transmits, not detonates," and hope changed weight. Mara touched Ethan's sleeve and steadied him without asking. Ethan said, "Then the secret is the weapon," and stepped toward the choice. Avery reached, fast and clean, to take the device. Helen's gun moved, and the counter ticked to a number that felt like a cliff. The room held its breath as Avery's hand cut toward the cradle. Helen said, "Stop," and her voice clipped the air cleaner than the gun's click. Lucas said, "We have 38 minutes, and the number felt like a cliff edge. Mara set her palm on Ethan's sleeve and steadied the shake he hit. "Avery," said transmit, and the city wakes wolves, and his calm sounded rented. Helen said, "He steals it, and we go blind," and took a half step to block. Ethan said, "No more riddles," and lifted the device into the cradle's cold mouth. The symbols spun and locked like teeth choosing a bite. Lucas said, "Uplink live," and the racks answered with a low choir. The voicemail bled into the hum like a ghost taking form. Helen said, "Who sent it?" and the question knocked dust off memory. Avery said, "Someone you already lost," and the timer shed a minute. The cradle's screen bloomed with a map that understood secrets better than streets. Lucas said, 3 nodes want sync," and his stylus circled wounds on the grid. Helen said, "Pick one we can reach," and checked exits as if counting lungs. Avery said, "Kill the middle," and the message dies softly, and watched Ethan choose. Mara said, "You were never safe on Harbor," and the word never tasted old. Ethan said, "We finish at the dome," and the room learned its next breath. The lights stuttered as if power doubted their plan. Lucas said, "Backup will hold," and hoped the wires believed him. Helen called in a patrol diversion she would own later. Avery said, "Once it speaks, it cannot unspeak," and let the warning stand. Mara tightened her coat and nodded once. The counter slid under 30. They climbed the observatory ridge, while night thinned like paper over light. Wind pushed at their backs as if hurrying the truth uphill. Lucas said, 22 minutes, and the dome answered with a hollow groan. Helen said, "I will take the heat," and meant indictments and shadows both. "Avery," said the sender, used your voicemail as a key and didn't say the name. Mara said, "Say it," and her voice had a steadiness she borrowed from storms. Ethan said, "Naomi," and the hill remembered the ambulance he could not outrun. The device warmed in his grip and found the beat it wanted. Lucas said, "If Naomi coded it, she trusted your ear," and opened the door. The dome smelled like dust and iron rain. Helen set a perimeter that felt like apology with teeth. The timer rolled to 19. Inside, the console woke like an animal that remembered its trainer. Lucas said, "Handshake in 10," and soldered a broken thought back together. Helen said, "Units inbound in 8," and her radio wore a lie that saved time. Avery said, "When it speaks, it indicts the wrong ears first," and watched the door. Mara set printouts beside the brass plate like offerings. Ethan said, "Naomi wanted witnesses," and seated the device in its old cradle. The mural seam exhaled cold that sharpened their choices. Lucas said, "We can mirror the stream and cut their leash," and fingers flew. Helen braced the entrance and chose the angle that hurt later. Avery said, "Decide who hears the first word," and finally sounded human. Ethan said, "Everyone," and the dome tightened around the vowel. The timer bled to 13. The clock hit 10, and the device found a voice that wasn't a bomb. Naomi's waveform rose from static with a calm that broke them open. Helen said, recording, and the badge on her chest felt heavier and right. Lucas said, "Mirrors live, and the stream braided to places that keep promises." Avery closed his eyes and let an old debt move through him. Mara said, "Let her finish," and guarded the last inch of silence. Naomi named dates, doors, and hands that cleaned Harbor Street to keep stains bright. Ethan said, "I hear you," and the dome swallowed the tremor in his breath. Siren stitched the hill with red thread as truth left the room. The counter reached 0, and held like a heart that chooses to rest. The device dimmed to a single ember. The city inhaled its answer. Dawn burned the fog off the ridge, and the observatory settled like a chest after a sprint. Helen called dispatch and used the word evidence as if it could hold. Lucas said, "Mirrors stayed up, and let relief breathe once." Mara wiped rain from the console and did not cry. Avery said, "The wolves will change masks," and watched the road. Ethan said, Naomi finished the message and the name softened the air. Sirens thinned and left a hush that asked for a next move. Helen said, "Chain of custody begins now," and clipped the recorder. Lucas packed the drives with careful hands that refused to shake. Mara said, "You hear her still," and Ethan nodded. The device dimmed to a coal that remembered heat. They stood together and learned the sound of aftermath. They descended the ridge into a city that pretended nothing had shifted. At the precinct, glass doors reflected a cleaner story than the files behind them. Helen said, "We log this before it learns to vanish," and led them inside. A captain asked questions with polished edges. Avery said, "Answer only what the record deserves," and stayed in the hallway. Lucas said, "We have checksums," and set the drives down like anchors. Mara waited near a vending machine and counted heartbeats. Ethan said, Naomi named names, and the room lost color. Helen said, "Then we do not blink," and signed 6 lines with a steady hand. Paper moved and truth found a slow bureaucratic gait. Outside, the sirens had the good manners to stay far away. Afternoon found Ethan on the ferry dock where the river kept secrets politely. The wind lifted a chill that felt earned. Mara said, "You can let some things sink," and stood beside him without touching. Ethan said, "She built a voice out of my silence, and watched gulls split the light." Lucas called to say redundancies held, and his calm steadied the day. Helen sent a brief text that read safe for now, and meant maybe. Avery did not call, which was a kind of message. Mara said, "You did not choose the door, but you walked through," and the river agreed. Ethan said, "I hear her less when I listen more," and learned a truce with memory. The city moved, and none of it asked for permission. Night returned with the confidence of habit, and the workshop lights carved small islands. Lucas said, "Backups live off-site," and placed a new lock on an old cabinet. Helen arrived without a knock, and set a sealed envelope on the bench. Helen said, "Internal affairs will circle, but the recording runs wider than their net," and took no chair. Avery stepped from the doorway like a shadow that paid rent. Avery said, "The sender is gone, but the system remains hungry," and met Ethan's eyes. Mara said, "Then we feed it truth until it chokes," and her voice did not waver. Ethan said, "We finish what she started," and opened the envelope. Inside lay a map with 3 points that were not on any grid. The device throbbed once, like a memory trying to be a plan. Later, Harbor Street wore rain like a secret it refused to share. Ethan walked alone and let the night test his steps. A payphone that should not work rang once and held. Ethan said, "I'm listening," and the line bloomed with static that remembered a voice. The whisper did not name him, yet knew where he would stand. It said, "They know where you are," and the words arrived new and old at once. He turned, and the alley was only an alley, except for a shape against the curb. A second metal heart lay ticking with a patience that had learned manners. Ethan said, "Not finished," and the rain agreed. Far off, a siren stitched a thin red thread through the dark. The countdown had chosen a circle instead of a line,